Well, welcome back to this series on becoming God's people. Last time I looked at Abram and God calling Abram in Genesis chapter 12, and how it's a little bit of a scandal that God calls one person out of all of the earth to this new relationship. Now, obviously, historically, we don't know that God only spoke to one person in this way. Uh, this is the one person we have recorded, and this is the one person whose family seemed to have panned out. It doesn't mean God didn't try others. It's just simply that this person was called and this person responded. But I think it is interesting this week as we look into Genesis 15 and this covenant that God makes with Abram. It is interesting to look at two facets of everything that is going on in this story of Abram and him becoming this great nation. The two facets that I find interesting are the kind of person that Abram is and the way that God interacts with this person. So first, we look at the kind of person that Abram is. We are used to, especially in the Christian tradition, looking at Abraham, as this individual who is righteous. In fact, when we read in Genesis 15 of this covenant, one of the things that we are told is that Abram was pretty morally upstanding. He was a righteous individual. He lived a good life. But let's look at the kind of person that he really is. And when we do that, we see that he's very, very flawed. In fact, when he goes from Genesis 12, God calls him and says, "Leave your home and your family and go to the land that I'm going to show you." Instantly, the very next story, Abram does this. He leaves. He goes down into what we would call the land of Israel or Palestine today, and wanders around in it. But as soon as things get difficult, as soon as there is a famine, Abram is in the land of Egypt. He's not there in Palestine. He's not in that land that God has promised to him. He is in a different land, in a different region where it's safe and easy and convenient. And I think that says something about the person of Abram, that he trusts God, yes, but there's a degree where when the going gets tough, he finds it much more difficult to trust God. And that resonates with me, at least. I don't know about you, that it's easy to trust God on certain levels, but at another level, it becomes a lot more difficult. And Abram finds that level in the famine. There's food scarcities, and so he goes to the land where there's provision, whether or not God has asked him to go to that land, or whether or not it's good for him to go to that land. And in fact, we find that it is not good for him, because he gets there and his wife is taken. And it's not until God intervenes that Abram gets his wife back. And it's not until God intervenes that Abram realizes how badly he's screwed up and how little he's actually trusted God in this entire process. And then, just like how I think of myself, Abram goes through this experience in Egypt and suddenly has this recognition, oh, God is going to take care of me. God is going to provide for me. And we get two stories back to back involving his nephew Lot. And those stories are them coming into the land of Israel, or what will be the land of Israel, the land of Canaan at this point. And Abram saying, hey, the land's opened up to both of us. You choose what you want. God's going to take care of me no matter what. And Abraham's nephew, obviously, Abram's nephew at this point takes the best looking land. And what we're seeing here is a level of trust. So we're seeing Abram, he trusts God and then kind of forgets about God. God rescues him. And then Abram trusts God again. So we get this roller coaster almost. And we see Abram trusting God all the way through chapter 14 when Sodom is invaded and Lot and his people are captured, and Abram trusting God, taking his people up and rescuing the people of Sodom and giving over a tenth of it to the king of Salem, and not thinking anything of it, not taking anything for himself, not taking the plunder that he is in the culture rightly to have possessed. He should have had choice of plunder because he rescued the plunder from the invading army. So Abram should have been wealthy because of this, but he turns it down and says, no, 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 no. God will make me wealthy. God will be the blessing to me, not my work. And so here we have Abram in a position of deep trust. And then we get to chapter 15, and I find chapter 15 a little turbulent, if I'm going to be honest. There's some little things in the chapter that give me pause. There really are. Like, I know it's a really small issue, but what do we do with the idea that God uses the divine name? And so does Abram in this passage. And that doesn't mean much to us. This what we call, the YHWH name, often pronounced Yahweh in today's world. But truthfully, it's something that we don't really know. But the interesting thing about it is in Exodus chapter 6, God says to Moses, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, didn't know me by name. And that little detail has been bothering me, partially because I think that it is not meant to be taken as they literally did not know what to call God. I think it has more to do with they did not understand the full breadth of God's character. But even that becomes problematic. It's just one of these details that I think that we should wrestle with and meditate on, because Abraham speaks the name of God, but doesn't really understand everything that means. And it comes out later in this chapter. Abram will call God by name, but doesn't understand what it means for God to be the one who is present, the one who will be present, the one who provides. And that comes out here in the idea that when we look through Genesis 15, there are two promises. One is a promise for children, and another is a promise for land. And God makes this promise to Abram. God and Abram are talking about who is going to be Abram's heir, and God says, don't worry, you're going to have kids. And this is where Abram says, oh, yeah, I trust you. I believe you when you say that. And we get the famous line that this was Abram's righteousness, that this showed his trust in God. And then God says, and all of this land that you see around you, I'm going to give you that. You're going to have all of this as a possession. And there Abram goes, wait, hold on. How? How are you going to give me this? And this is an interesting theme for me, that Abram believes God that he will have children, but does not believe God when it comes to the land. Here is what I think when I read this passage. I think that Abram understood God to mean you're going to have kids. What he didn't think was you're going to have kids by Sarah. In other words, Abram saw the fact that he's going to have kids and went, oh, okay, I'm going to sleep with a woman other than Sarah and I'm going to produce kids. Lots of them. Great. And we see that when Sarah approaches Abram and says, I'm too old to give you kids. Here, let's make a pact to use my slave. This is this by our standards today is pretty horrific, because obviously Hagar does not have a choice in the matter. In fact, Hagar's name implies that she's an alien, she's a foreigner. It's an Egyptian name. I think it means foreigner, and it implies that they are abusing the alien, the foreigner, the refugee. Well, maybe not refugee, but slave. They're abusing this person who is not one of their own. And that's one of the things that the Bible is subtly trying to tell us, that this is wrong. What they are doing is wrong. It seems good in their eyes because all they are looking at is pragmatically, God has promised us kids. Well, how can we accomplish that promise on our own? What is the most pragmatic approach? Assault the woman who we have complete dominance over. And that's what they do. So Abram, he's understanding God's going to give me kids. Yeah, I got slave women. I can just do whatever I want to them and have children. And you see here we have Abram able to rationalize on his own how the promise will be fulfilled, but unable to rationalize how he's ever going to conquer this land. And so he's, to some extent, trusting God, but at another extent, he just doesn't quite get it, which I think that resonates with me, because there's so many times where I'm the same way. I want to trust God, but I just don't quite get it. I don't quite understand the assignment. And that is Abram in this passage. We will see later, when you get to chapter 17, and God comes to Abram, he is much more trusting, and he's much more open, to the point where when we see chapters 17, 18, this idea of Sodom come up and the destruction of Sodom, Abram is not, he is not looking out for his own self-interest. He is looking out for righteousness. God, act justly towards Sodom. Protect the righteous. And God does. God listens. So it's a character change with Abram as he goes from one extreme to the other. But we also see this kind of fluctuation in his character where he's trying to grasp it. He's trying to get there, but doesn't quite do that at first and has to take time. And God has to be patient with Abram. And that leads to the second point, that God is very patient with Abram. He does not call the perfect person. In fact, he doesn't call a person who is extremely righteous. Rather, he works with a person who shows a willingness to admit he is wrong and work with God. He's a person who's willing to listen to God continually and learn from his mistakes. And God works within Abram's culture, within Abram's ideas. The end of chapter 15, the entire second half of chapter 15, is a covenant relationship and a covenant service that looks very strange to us. Cutting animals in half and then walking through them looks extremely strange. But we are specifically told that this is all a vision. Abram cuts the animals up, lays them out, and then sits and has a vision of God walking through the animals. And all of this is exactly what Abram would have expected. God is working within Abram's culture and his preconceived notions in order to transform Abram. In other words, God gets down to where Abram is and takes him on the journey from there. God does not expect Abram to have to throw away these cultural ideas. God does not expect Abram to be perfect. God expects Abram to be who he is and works with Abram from that point in order to move him to where God wants him. In fact, that's what we see again and again in the Bible. God starts with people where they are, where their culture has influenced them, where they understand God, and then works with them patiently as they fail. Because again, think about it, even after God comes down and makes this covenant with Abram, Abram assaults his slave. This is after the covenant. Abraham, by a lot of our definitions, Abram should have known better. Well, at least we'd like to think, but he didn't. And God still works with him to push him towards the righteousness that God wants. Yes, he is righteous by just accepting that God will give him children. Yeah, just that trust, that acceptance puts him in a great position. It puts him in a class of morality that we all would like to have. God calling us righteous. But at the same time, he certainly has more to learn, more to understand, and he has a journey to take. And God still has to work with him on that journey, beginning where he's at and working him to where God wants him to be. And so those are the 2 points that I had when I looked at this passage in Genesis 15. I think they speak to me on a very personal level, that this is who I might be. I'm somebody who wants to follow God, but doesn't always get it right. Sometimes I have to be pushed harder than I would think is necessary. Sometimes God has to be extremely patient with me. Sometimes God has to work with me because of my cultural understandings. And you know what? God does that. God does not think that that is somehow undignified. No. God accepts the issues there and continues to work with me. As always, if you have questions or comments, throw them down in the comment section. I'd love to interact with people on this. And let me know how I'm doing. Let me know what you think of this series. Until we meet again, God bless.